She was a bright and beautiful 18-year-old with big dreams.
She always wanted to work at NASA. She was very smart in school.
She was the joy and the light of the family.
But on a cold winter night, that light is suddenly extinguished.
She was lying on the bed, covered in blood.
Was it an intentional act or was it an accident?
Can you tell us what happened?
They don't understand who could have done this to her.
The police only have one suspect.
People were saying, this is a bad person.
Yeah, they were like yelling at each other.
For a detective, that's a huge red flag.
But does the suspect have a motive?
This is your fault. There's so many things that are unsaid and unseen in relationships.
I don't care anymore, whatever!
They didn't know anything about him.
Every time!
One day, it just explodes.
Can the investigators pick up the pieces and put together a case against her killer?
I legit was scared. He was acting insane.
Juries are extremely unpredictable.
A lot of people don't get justice at all.
Police! Freeze!
January 16th, 2022. It's early Sunday in Indianapolis, Indiana, the Hoosier State's capital and largest city.
Indianapolis is a great place for you to raise your family.
There's tons of things to do, so it attracts a lot of people.
But the vibrant city shuts down on a bitter winter night.
It gets cold down there for sure.
It's quiet, the streets are typically empty.
At around 1:30 that morning, the wintertime quiet is about to be broken by the wail of sirens.
911 dispatch got 2 phone calls back to back.
Hello? Where's the location of your emergency? I don't know. I don't know.
The caller abruptly hangs up. But soon another call comes in from the same phone.
911, where's the location of your emergency?
911 gets a second call, and this one is even more desperate. This is coming from a woman caller.
I need help. Where are you?
Then that call abruptly ends as well.
However, the dispatcher is able to pinpoint where the calls originated.
GPS data from the cell phone show that the call was made from an apartment complex on the southeast side of Indianapolis.
It's ringing from East Hannah Avenue. He was crying and screaming before he hung up. Okay. I'm gonna send it out.
Police quickly arrive at the apartment complex and begin searching for the 911 callers.
They didn't know exactly which apartment it was. They happened to notice that there was a door open.
They walk inside the door and they see blood in the living room area. They go further into the apartment and they find a woman.
Ma'am, are you okay?
She's lying on the bed, covered with a blanket.
When they pulled back the blanket that she was covered in, there was a gunshot wound to the arm and to her torso.
I've got a gunshot wound in the EMT.
Police and paramedics attempt to stabilize the young woman, but she's lost a lot of blood.
Can you tell us what happened?
I can't.
Who did this?
She really couldn't tell police too much. All she could say was her name, Daytara.
In some ways, 18-year-old Daytara Johnson was a typical teenager.
She always had a big smile on her face. She just enjoyed life.
She was very social. She always had a lot of friends.
She was just the life of the party. Wherever we was at, she would just bring the energy.
She was going to make her presence be known for sure.
Everyone loved her and everyone enjoyed her presence.
But Daytera was far from typical.
Most kids be outside in the summertime playing. She'd be in the house reading books.
School was a breeze for her. She was very intelligent.
She made straight A's all 12 years in school. She was very gifted.
Eventually, Daytera focused that intelligence on a specific goal.
She wanted to be a mathematician and a physicist.
She always wanted to work for NASA.
After graduating from high school in 2021, Daytera moved into her own apartment.
She really loved her freedom. She loved her privacy and really just wanted to start that journey on her own and begin college soon.
The gifted student also caught the attention of the opposite sex.
Growing up, she was more of a tomboy. Then as she got older, she loved her long nails and lashes.
Daytera's a very beautiful girl. The dudes gravitated towards her.
But she really wasn't interested in a serious relationship because she didn't want anything to interfere with her independence, her education, or her career goals.
But that changed when she met 20-year-old Anthony York.
She met him from her friends.
Daytera and Anthony actually met the spring of 2021, and he was immediately smitten.
The attraction was mutual.
He didn't really talk too much, but he was cool.
I'm glad you finally had the nerve to tell me how you feel.
You're so beautiful, it's intimidating.
I definitely saw them liking each other, for sure.
That attraction was there from the beginning. And from there, they just built a relationship and really kicked it off.
With everything going her way, Daytera felt like she was on top of the world.
I've got a gunshot wound. I need EMT.
But now, her future hangs in the balance as paramedics struggle to keep her alive.
She has 2 gunshot wounds to her body.
She was losing a lot of blood, and the paramedics could see that the situation was critical.
Can you tell us what happened?
The officers ask over and over.
Who did this?
But there's no answer.
They knew that they had to try to get her to the hospital as soon as possible. Daytera is pretty much going in and out of the door.
Then she lost consciousness.
She can't tell them anything else.
18-year-old Daytera Johnson was enjoying the most exciting time of her life, becoming an adult with an apartment of her own.
Daytera was an independent young lady, able to get her first apartment at 18.
I was proud of her when she got her place.
She also had an exciting new relationship.
Friends had introduced her to 20-year-old Anthony York, and they had been dating ever since.
But now Daytera's life is hanging by a thread.
Daytera was found lying on the bed, bleeding from 2 gunshot wounds.
Daytera was still alive, but she was unconscious.
As Daytera is transported to the hospital, detectives arrive at the scene to begin their investigation.
One of the first things that the detectives noticed is that there was forced entry into the apartment. The door had been kicked in.
The apartment appears to be in a bit of a disarray, as if there was a struggle. It also appears to be blood in the living room.
And a clue to the weapon used by the shooter.
Hey, we got a shell casing.
Because the shell casing and the blood were in the living room, the detectives determined that the shooting had taken place there.
What's not clear to detectives is how Daytera ended up in the bedroom.
They couldn't determine whether she had crawled into the bedroom or somebody had helped her because she was wrapped in a blanket.
In the bathroom, they find a bloody towel.
A bloody towel indicates that someone did try to stop the bleed.
But was it Daytera or the mysterious man who made the first 911 call?
They don't know who this male was that placed this 911 call. They don't know whether it was a boyfriend, whether it was a neighbor. They don't know who this individual is.
Was it the shooter? Was it someone who just heard the gunshots and came in?
If it was the shooter, why did he call 911? And if it wasn't the shooter, why did he flee the scene?
Did he run away in a panic? Did he run after the shooter? Did he have anything to do with this? They didn't know.
In addition to the evidence found at the scene, detectives also take note of what they don't find.
Detectives never found her keys. They never found her cell phone.
Could have been a robbery gone wrong. Yeah, he didn't mean a shooter.
After going through the apartment, detectives talk to the manager of the complex.
They start asking that property manager, does she have a car? If she does have a car, where's it usually parked?
The property manager was able to confirm that she does have a vehicle.
She always parks in the same space.
Do you know where that is?
Right over there.
But the space is empty.
That car isn't here anymore.
The shooter probably took it. Do you have surveillance on the complex?
Yes, we do.
There are security cameras directly pointed in the direction of her apartment. So the property manager goes and gets all of that footage and then hands it over to police.
While the manager was retrieving the video and handing it over to police, detectives put out a be on the lookout alert for Daytera's car.
I need a bolo on Datora Johnson's vehicle.
Then they expand their search for clues to the area outside her apartment, including a nearby dumpster.
They couldn't see much in the dumpster, just some garbage bags, nothing out of the ordinary.
But then something catches their eye. A duffel bag.
They said it was on top of everything in the dumpster.
Clearly, this duffel bag had just been dumped.
So detectives investigate further.
Inside the duffel bag, detectives found some men's clothing.
They also find ammunition, and that ammunition looks similar to the spent casing they found in Daytera's apartment.
Detectives take the bag as evidence and begin to canvass the residents of the apartment complex.
So police start interviewing some neighbors, and they start to talk to two women who live near Daytera's apartment.
There were two young women that remember hearing Daytera and a male arguing.
Yeah, they were like yelling at each other.
When was that?
It was around 1:30.
Those two women say that they heard arguing right before two gunshots go off.
Do you know who she was arguing with?
We don't really know her like that. We weren't all up in her business or anything.
But they say the voice did sound familiar.
They've heard that same voice coming from that apartment before.
It sounded like the same man's voice that she would always get into arguments with.
It was probably her boyfriend.
Neighbors of 18-year-old Daytera Johnson have just told detectives that they heard loud voices coming from her apartment moments before Daytera was shot.
Those neighbors say that Daytera and a gentleman was arguing, and after that they heard two bangs.
And this isn't the first argument they've heard in her apartment.
Yeah, they were like yelling at each other.
One particular neighbor told the detective that she used to hear a bunch of arguing and fighting, but the police was never called.
Was that the same voice you heard tonight?
It sounded the same.
And that was her boyfriend?
I think so.
The neighbors didn't know the boyfriend's name, so the next move for detectives was to reach out to Daytera's family for more information.
But before they can conduct interviews with the family,
Homicide.
a call from the hospital changes the nature of the investigation.
Daytera is rushed to the hospital. She undergoes surgery. Doctors do everything they can possibly do to save her life. But it's too late. She doesn't survive.
Daytera's family is also contacted and break down at the news.
When I heard the news, I went into shock.
My husband just barely could speak, and he was like, "She gone."
When detectives arrive at her parents' home, they find a family struggling with their grief.
I was asleep. My twin brother, he had Brandon in my room. He was like, "She gone." I hear a lot of commotion in the front room.
My dad, he was in the living room, and police is in there. He was just crying nonstop.
But Daytera's parents are determined to see justice done.
Is it possible we could ask you a few questions to find out who did this?
Yeah, of course. Whatever we can do to help.
The first thing they tell detectives is that they can't imagine anyone wanting to hurt Daytera.
She's loved by everybody.
Is it possible that she might be involved in something that is dangerous?
Maybe something she didn't tell you about.
No, we were very close.
Detectives want to know, was Daytera involved in anything, gang activity, drugs?
Due to the forced entry, this possibly could be a drug deal gone bad or even some kind of gang retaliation.
But Daytera's family is adamant that she wasn't mixed up in anything like that.
Is anyone that she had problems with, disagreements with?
Her boyfriend, Anthony York.
They knew that they fought a lot, but she didn't seem scared. It was just more she was annoyed when they fought.
She would just be like, "We argue, or we got in an argument." It's just like how you vent to your sister.
When they got in arguments, did it ever turn physical?
Honestly, we don't know.
Daytera didn't mention Anthony a lot.
The family had only encountered Anthony a handful of times.
It was kind of strange. We never knew who he was, what he was about.
I knew a lot of people surrounded by him. Like, I grew up with his mom and his dad. And I met him one time, but didn't personally know him.
And while the impression he made wasn't alarming, it wasn't reassuring either.
The first time we met him, the interaction was kind of weird. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't say that I'm Daytera's boyfriend.
He was just standoffish. He really wouldn't look at us too much.
Hoping to learn more, detectives return to the station and file requests for her social media and phone records.
Social media is such a huge aid in helping an investigation. These days, everybody posts everything on their social media.
While waiting for a response to the requests, detectives review the security camera video from Daytera's apartment complex.
They get an opportunity to look at the surveillance video, and that surveillance video tells a lot.
Yeah, that looks like her car.
Here we go.
They can tell that it's a young black man and he's carrying a duffel bag.
He goes and he dumps the duffel bag in the dumpster.
You see him go back inside the apartment, then come out and get inside the car and pull away.
That's gotta be the shooter. That could be anybody.
With the darkness, the poor quality of the video, and the fact that the man had on heavy clothes because it was winter, it was almost impossible to identify him.
Could it be Anthony York? There may be an easy way to find out.
Detectives retrieved the duffel bag that had been collected as evidence from the dumpster.
They go through the duffel bag again.
And under closer examination, detectives find something.
the detectives found a bond warrant.
This is huge for the investigation. This is the break they needed.
There it is. Anthony York.
After finding a bail bond warrant bearing the name of Daytera Johnson's boyfriend, Anthony York, detectives are now convinced he's the person responsible for her death.
Here we go.
Video from a security camera showed only one person entering and leaving Daytera's apartment, and only Anthony would have a motive to dispose of a duffel bag full of his clothes.
But is Anthony York capable of murder?
Daytera's family didn't know much about him, so detectives started digging into his background.
And what they find is alarming.
Auto theft, resisting arrest, and criminal recklessness. And not one, but 2 outstanding warrants.
This is a guy that is basically running from the law.
Armed with these outstanding warrants, detectives rush to the address on file for Anthony York.
A man answers the door. He identifies himself as Anthony's brother, Dominic.
He tells the detectives that Anthony isn't there.
Do you know where I can find him?
I don't know. I don't keep track of him.
Dominic states that he didn't have any idea of where he was or when he would return.
Do you know what this is about?
I heard about that girl that got killed. I know he'd been dating her.
Do you know where Anthony was last night?
Nah, man. I don't know anything about it.
Detectives asked Dominic to get in touch with them if he heard from Anthony, but they didn't really have any confidence that he would.
When they return to the station, the detectives start reviewing the social media accounts they've been given access to. But Daytera's online presence is more complex than anticipated.
Daytera had a social media account that basically anyone could see, but she also had a separate account that was only for her close friends. On that account, she would post things about problems in her relationship, like fighting and Anthony's jealousy.
It was kind of like little petty stuff that would turn bigger because of the person he was.
She started coming out and saying they had a toxic relationship. Like they'd be arguing and fighting a lot.
She specifically talked about how she had been on and off in her relationship with Anthony York.
Hey, come over here.
And as detectives dig deeper, they find things that are very disturbing.
Daytera had actually sent this audio clip to a friend stating that Anthony had threatened her with a gun.
I told him to leave because we just couldn't stop fighting and I needed a minute. And that's like when he pulled out a gun and said that he wasn't going anywhere. It was crazy. He calmed down after that, but I legit was like scared for a second. He was acting insane.
And that isn't even the most alarming thing detectives find.
Look at the dates on the posts.
That's weird.
Someone after the shooting had been posting on her social media.
One post said, "I'm in heaven now," and another one promoting a fundraiser to raise money for funeral costs.
Daytera's family is shocked when detectives check to see if they've been posting on Daytera's accounts.
They didn't know anything about this.
Concluding that Anthony is likely behind the posts, detectives' next move is to review the data submitted by Daytera's cell phone provider.
The detectives could see that there were 2 calls made to 911, but there were also phone calls made to another number before those 2 calls were made to 911.
The number belongs to Anthony York's mother.
Within an 8-minute time period, someone had called Anthony's mother several times.
None of the calls were answered.
Detectives wondered if Anthony had panicked after shooting Daytera and then tried to call his mother before he fled the scene.
Before they can put a trace on the phone, detectives get word that Daytera's car has been found.
I was actively on social media posting her car because I'm like, whoever killed her has her car.
Soon afterwards, someone contacted Daytera's mother, and sure enough, detectives go and they find Daytera's car parked about 5 miles away from her apartment.
Check this out.
When detectives search the car, they find a driver's license. But it's not Daytera's.
The name on the driver's license was Dominic York. Somehow, the driver's license of Anthony's brother had ended up in Daytera's car.
Now the detectives don't know who committed this crime.
Did Anthony call his brother for help when he couldn't reach his mother?
Oh, call him. Get him down to the station.
Well, that's not gonna happen.
Dominic is already in custody.
They find out that he's actually in jail for unrelated charges.
But for the detectives, it's an opportunity.
Can you believe it?
They say, you know what? Why don't we start to just listen to some of his phone calls that he's making from the jail?
It doesn't take long for the strategy to pay off.
One call in particular was interesting.
Dominic called a woman named Felicia Hurley.
Detectives run a background check on this Felicia Hurley and learn that she actually resides in Phoenix, Arizona.
So why is Dominic calling her?
That's weird.
What do you mean?
In the phone call, Dominic is giving Felicia some advice.
It was obvious that he knew that their conversation was not private.
He was talking in code.
Tell him to lay low. It's hot.
Detectives realized he was sending a message to Anthony.
After listening to jailhouse phone calls between Dominic York and a woman named Felicia Hurley, detectives in Indianapolis believe they have a lead on Dominic's brother, Anthony, the main suspect in the murder of 18-year-old Daytera Johnson.
We thought he was still in the city, that people were just hiding him out. I had no idea he made it all the way to Phoenix.
Detectives then contacted law enforcement in Phoenix, Arizona for them to work together and see if they could locate Anthony.
3 weeks after the murder, investigators fly from Indianapolis to Phoenix.
They have to find Anthony and they have to find Felicia. So they get to Phoenix and they actually pull Felicia over during a traffic stop. So now they have her in custody and they can start asking some questions.
You know Anthony York?
I do, yeah.
She's friends with Anthony through Dominic, and Anthony had actually been staying with her.
But she insists she initially didn't know he was on the run from the law.
She's alleging that she didn't know anything about any outstanding crime, any warrants.
She says that Anthony came to Phoenix to get out of Indianapolis because a big winter storm was coming.
Did he ever tell you why he was really here?
No, but I got a little curious after talking with Dominic, and he told me to tell Anthony to lay low.
So, Felicia went to a court records website.
She found that he had 2 outstanding warrants.
But that's not all.
It's when she saw social media that she knew, wait a minute, this guy's on the run for murder.
What did you do when you found out?
I didn't do anything.
She was too afraid to say anything to Anthony.
She didn't want Anthony to do anything to her.
Did he threaten you?
No, he didn't have to.
Felicia says she just doesn't feel safe with Anthony around.
Let's go.
The detectives pass the information on to local law enforcement, who immediately head to Felicia's apartment.
Police! Freeze!
And on the patio, there's Anthony York.
Hands up. Turn around. Put your hands on the back of your head.
He is arrested without incident.
On February 10th, the investigators sit down with Anthony in a Phoenix interview room.
You know why you were picked up?
I got a couple of old warrants.
And a new one for murder.
Anthony says he's not surprised.
Anthony admits that he was in Daytera's apartment the night of the shooting, but he says he has nothing to do with it.
You want to tell us what happened?
I'm gonna tell you, but man, I still can't even believe it myself.
According to Anthony, it was a bad night from the start.
Anthony said that he and Daytera were broken up, that they had decided to go their separate ways.
What was the problem?
A lot of things, man.
Anthony says they've been arguing a lot.
He was pretty convinced that she was seeing another man.
He did not know who that other person was.
Why'd you go over there if you had broken up?
I went over to get my stuff.
He was only there to retrieve some of his items from that apartment.
He did admit to the fact that they had had an argument.
This is your fault, not mine. You're the one always messing around.
I don't care anymore, whatever.
Anthony says he just wanted to get his things.
He stepped outside to go and throw something in the dumpster, some things that he had in her apartment that he no longer needed.
That's when it happened, man.
What happened?
He stated that when he went to the dumpster that someone went into her apartment.
He said he didn't know who it was.
He says an unknown man walked into Daytera's apartment and shot her.
Anthony York has just told Indianapolis detectives that his girlfriend, 18-year-old Daytera Johnson, was killed by a mysterious man who slipped into her apartment.
It was a crazy night.
Anthony told police that him and Daytera were breaking up and that he had gone over to her apartment to get some things that he had left there.
He admits they argued while he was there, but says it wasn't anything serious.
Anthony tells police this was just a breakup. It wasn't the biggest deal, but he went to go grab some of his clothes and put it in his duffel bag.
I decided I didn't need them, so I just threw them in the dumpster.
You threw away a duffel bag?
Yeah, I ain't need it.
He says that while he was out by the dumpster, he heard 2 gunshots.
He says that he heard the shots, turned around, and saw a man running out of Daytera's apartment.
Did you recognize him?
No.
What did he look like?
I don't know.
He says, I don't know, he was wearing a mask.
Alarmed, Anthony rushed back into the apartment.
What happened? What happened?
He went back into that apartment and seen that his girlfriend was shot.
He says he called 911, but he didn't know Daytera's address. So he was trying to figure it out so he can tell dispatch. And that's when Daytera got the phone and asked for help.
But detectives know that 911 wasn't the only number he'd called using her phone.
Phone calls were made to Anthony's mom.
Why did you call your mother before you called 911?
Man, I didn't know what to do.
He said he called his mom because he was in a panic and he didn't know what else to do. And so he called 911 and then he took off.
Why did you leave?
Because I knew y'all would sit here and try to pin this on me.
Why did you take her phone?
Daytera's phone.
I just picked it up. I don't know, it was a crazy situation.
He said when he realized he had her phone, he threw the phone out of the window. He said he didn't know where.
The detectives have heard enough.
At that point, they let him know that they have video surveillance and there is no one else that could have been there.
You want to explain that?
I'm done. Give me a lawyer.
Cuff him.
Just get him out of here.
Get up.
They booked him on murder charges and they extradited him back to Indiana.
After his charge, it made me feel more at peace of the situation. He got what came to him.
With Anthony in custody, police and prosecutors assemble the case that they'll take to trial.
There's a lot of circumstantial evidence in this case.
And the evidence proved that Anthony was lying about what happened.
Nobody was on the videotape in the apartments besides him, so that story was bogus.
For trial, the DA's office put together their own story, one they believed they could prove was true.
Datera was a young woman. She's living on her own for the first time. She doesn't really know how to get out of this relationship with this guy.
On January 16th, the tension in the relationship boiled over.
The prosecutors suspect that Anthony got upset over something. Datera had posted on her social media accusing him of cheating.
You don't put my name out there.
If you're afraid of getting called out, don't do what you did.
Prosecutors believe that Datera and Anthony got into this big blowout argument.
At some point, Datera locked Anthony out of the apartment.
Get out. Let me in. Open the door.
But a locked door couldn't stop Anthony.
Anthony forced his way back inside the apartment.
You don't shut me out.
Stay away from me. Anthony.
Whether he meant to shoot her or not, they still don't know. And they actually do believe that at first he tried to help her.
You're okay, you're okay?
There was some panic in him.
Anthony called his mother first because he really did not want to call 911.
But when he couldn't get his mother, he made the call.
He did call 911, and he hung up with them quickly.
Then he started getting rid of evidence that he'd been there.
He decided to grab that duffel bag, dispose of any evidence that may have shown that he was in that apartment.
While he was doing that, Datera managed to pick up her phone.
Datera was able to make that phone call to 911, and then he came back. He took that phone, he got her keys, and he fled the scene.
Looking ahead to the trial, the prosecutor is confident, and Anthony York isn't.
Anthony knew that if this case went to trial, chances are that he would be convicted of murder. So he takes a plea deal, and he pleads guilty to voluntary manslaughter.
Prosecutors know that it's better to offer a plea deal and know that the person is going to receive some time than take your chances with a jury.
Anthony is sentenced to 30 years in prison with an option for his sentence to be modified after he served 17 years.
To Datera's friends, the sentence isn't nearly enough.
It makes my skin crawl, honestly. You took someone's life, someone who you were supposed to love.
And it means Datera's family will never know the full truth.
We didn't get any explanation on what happened because he signed a plea deal. So we didn't go to trial and he didn't explain.
And they will never forget what they lost on that cold winter night.
Datera, I'm still thinking about you every day.
She had a beautiful soul. She loved everybody. She was beautiful, a beautiful person.
She was definitely a sweetheart, but she was a big sister at heart. She never let nobody play with us. I always respect that.
I miss my daughter. I wish that these young people would go seek help. Don't put your family in the situation that we're in, because we'll never be the same.
Los Angeles in the summer of 1980 was a city of contrasts. Along Sunset Boulevard, bright lights, nightclubs, bars, and the restless movement of people created an atmosphere in which strangers could disappear into the crowd almost effortlessly. It was a place where young people lived on the margins, where prostitutes worked the streets, where people who had left home searched for money or temporary shelter, and where the boundary between ordinary nightlife and danger could become dangerously thin. In the final days of May and through July, a series of murders began to emerge from that environment. At first, the killings did not necessarily appear to belong to the same story. The victims were discovered in different locations. Some bodies were left near roads or freeway ramps. Others were found in parking areas or isolated places. The circumstances varied. But slowly, investigators began to see connections. The victims were often vulnerable women. Many had been encountered around Hollywood and Sunset Boulevard. Several had been shot with .25 caliber ammunition. And behind those scattered discoveries was a relationship between two people that would eventually become one of the most disturbing elements of the case. Douglas Daniel Clark and Carol Mary Bundy. The crimes would later become known as the Sunset Strip Killers or the Sunset Slasher Killings. Legally, Douglas Clark would ultimately be convicted of 6 first-degree murders. But the investigation would reveal something more complicated than a simple story of one killer. Carol Bundy had been his lover. She had helped obtain the weapons. She later admitted killing Jack Murray and participating in the concealment of a victim's remains. And eventually, she became the person who gave investigators information that helped connect Clark to a series of murders that had initially appeared unrelated. The story began with a relationship. It ended with 6 death sentences, a life sentence, decades in prison, and unanswered questions about how many lives may have been touched by the violence. Douglas Daniel Clark was born in 1948. By the time the murders occurred, he was approximately 32 years old. His life did not immediately appear to mark him as the central figure in a multiple murder. Investigation. He worked in a factory environment and lived in the Los Angeles area. Yet investigators would later learn about another side of his life, particularly his activities around Hollywood and Sunset Boulevard. Clark acknowledged that he frequently went to Hollywood looking for prostitutes. He visited clubs and areas where prostitution was common, and he sometimes went with Carol Bundy while looking for women. That behavior would later become important because many of the women connected to the killings were encountered in precisely this environment. Clark's relationship with Bundy began in late 1979. Bundy was about a decade older than him. At the time, she lived in an apartment complex in Los Angeles where Jack Murray worked as the manager. Murray had also been romantically involved with Bundy. Then Bundy met Clark at a nightclub. The two quickly entered a relationship, and their lives became increasingly intertwined. At various points they lived together, including in the Van Nuys and Burbank areas. Their relationship was unstable, but it was also intense. According to evidence later presented in court, their conversations and fantasies increasingly involved extreme sexual themes, including fantasies involving dead bodies. This detail would become important because the prosecution's case did not simply portray Clark as someone who happened to kill. It presented evidence suggesting that violence, sexuality, and death had become connected within his fantasies. But at this stage, none of that was visible to the public. There was no obvious warning that a relationship between two people would become connected to a string of killings. In April 1980, one decision would provide investigators with a critical piece of evidence months later. Bundy purchased 2 Raven .25 caliber handguns from a pawn shop in Van Nuys. According to Bundy's later testimony, Clark had selected the weapons and asked her to purchase them because he said he could not buy a gun himself. The 2 Raven pistols were not simply objects in the background of the relationship. They would eventually become central to the prosecution's physical evidence. Investigators later recovered one of the Raven pistols, a nickel-finished weapon, hidden at Clark's workplace. Ballistic testing connected ammunition recovered from the murder victims to that gun. This would become one of the strongest links between Clark and the killings because it did not depend solely upon Bundy's statements. Before the murders that would define the case, however, there was another incident. On April 27, 1980, a woman identified in court only as Charlene A. encountered Clark on Sunset Boulevard. According to her testimony, she entered his vehicle. The encounter suddenly became violent when Clark attacked her with a knife. Charlene fought back and managed to escape. She survived, but her injuries were serious. She later identified Clark. This incident became part of the prosecution against him, although the legal history of those charges would later become complicated. In 1992, the California Supreme Court reversed Clark's convictions for attempted murder and mayhem relating to the attack on Charlene A., while leaving the principal murder convictions intact. The incident nevertheless provides an important piece of the chronology because it occurred shortly before the series of murders began. By late May, Marnette Comer disappeared. Comer was a young woman who had lived a transient life and worked as a prostitute. She was last seen around May 21, 1980, wearing a pink t-shirt bearing the words, "Daddy's Girl." Her disappearance would become the beginning of one of the most important connections in the investigation. On June 30th, her nude body was discovered in a ravine near Foothill Boulevard. She had been dead for some time. The autopsy showed multiple gunshot wounds to the chest, including .25 caliber ammunition. At the time, the discovery was another violent death in a city already accustomed to crime. But the significance of Marnette Comer's death would become clearer only after another woman was found dead. Her name was Exie Wilson. Wilson's body was discovered in a parking lot, but her head was missing. Days later, investigators found a wooden box in an alley. Inside was Wilson's head, wrapped in jeans and the pink "Daddy's Girl" t-shirt associated with Marnette Comer. One piece of clothing had suddenly connected two apparently separate victims. The implications were disturbing. The killings were no longer simply isolated murders. Something linked the victims together. That connection would become even stronger when investigators examined the ammunition. The same .25 caliber weapon was emerging repeatedly in the evidence. Meanwhile, two more victims had already been found. On June 12th, Cynthia Chandler, 16, and her half-sister Gina Morano, 15, were discovered near a freeway ramp beside Forest Lawn Cemetery. Chandler was blonde. Morano had dark hair. Both had been shot. Morano had been shot in the head, while Chandler had wounds to the head and chest. The evidence suggested they had died at least several hours before their bodies were discovered. There was little blood at the location, suggesting that they may have been killed elsewhere and transported there. That detail would later fit a pattern investigators associated with Clark. The suspected killing location and the place where a body was abandoned were not necessarily the same. As the bodies accumulated, the investigation began moving toward a question that would eventually dominate the case. Who was selecting these women, and how were the separate killings connected? At that moment, investigators did not yet have the complete answer. They did not yet know the significance of two Raven pistols. They did not yet know what was happening inside Clark and Bundy's relationship. And they did not yet know that the person who would eventually help expose the case was herself. Involved in a killing, the summer had only begun, and the most important pieces of the investigation were still hidden. Inside a garage, inside telephone records, inside a gun, inside the memories of witnesses, and eventually inside the words of Carol Bundy herself. The story of the Sunset Strip killers was beginning to take shape, but for the victims, there had been no warning that their lives were about to become part of a case that would remain in the history of Los Angeles for decades. By the middle of June 1980, the investigation in Los Angeles was beginning to acquire a pattern, although the people investigating it did not yet have the complete picture. Cynthia Chandler was 16. Gina Morano was 15. Their bodies had been discovered near a freeway ramp beside Forest Lawn Cemetery on June 12th. Both had been shot with .25 caliber ammunition, and the absence of a large amount of blood at the location suggested that the girls had probably been killed somewhere else before their bodies were transported there. That distinction mattered. It meant the place where investigators found a body might reveal almost nothing about where the killing itself had occurred. Somewhere else, potentially inside a vehicle, a garage, or another private location. There could have been an earlier scene that had never been discovered. The investigation, therefore, depended on more than the physical locations where the victims were found. Investigators needed to understand the victims' final movements, the people they had encountered, and the objects or weapons that could connect one case to another. Then something unusual happened. After Chandler and Morano were found, a man began making telephone calls to people connected to the two girls. On June 16th, a man called Lori Briggs. He claimed to be a police officer investigating the murders. At first, such a call might have sounded plausible. Families and acquaintances often receive contact from investigators after a homicide. But the conversation soon became strange. The caller appeared to know details about the murders, while his manner did not resemble that of a professional investigator. More importantly, he seemed interested in people who had relationships with the victims. The call created a new problem for detectives. Someone was apparently following the investigation closely enough to discuss it with people connected to the dead girls. Later, a witness identified the caller's voice as that of Douglas Clark. The telephone calls would become one of the most important behavioral clues in the case because they demonstrated something investigators could not easily explain away as coincidence. Whoever was making them had a connection to the murders, or at least an unusual interest in them. Then came another call. On June 22nd, Mindy Cohen received a telephone call from a man who again presented himself as an investigator. The caller knew about the deaths of Cynthia Chandler and Gina Morano. 2 days later, on June 24th, Cohen received another call. This time, the nature of the conversation was far more disturbing. The caller claimed that he had killed the two girls and threatened Cohen, telling her that she would become the next victim. Cohen went to the police. Investigators began examining the telephone records. The call placed on June 24th had been made at approximately 7:11 in the morning from the apartment on Verdugo Street that Clark and Bundy used. Clark was scheduled to leave for work at approximately 7:28, and his workplace was only a few minutes away. The timing did not establish every detail of what had happened, but it placed Clark in a location connected directly to a threatening call made by someone claiming responsibility for the murders. It was another piece added to an investigation that was becoming increasingly difficult to dismiss as a collection of unrelated crimes. Meanwhile, the victims continued to accumulate. On June 23rd, Karen Jones was killed. Jones was a prostitute. At approximately 2 in the morning, a patrol officer on Sunset Boulevard encountered her and warned her not to remain in the area for too long. A resident later heard a scream. At approximately 3:15 a.m., Jones's body was discovered beside the road. She had been shot in the head with a .25 caliber bullet. The circumstances were different from the discovery of Chandler and Morano, but the ammunition created another potential connection. Jones had been seen alive only a short time before her death. Someone had encountered her during the early morning hours, and then, within a relatively short period, she was dead. That same morning, another victim was discovered. Her name was Exie Wilson. Her body was found in a restaurant parking lot, but something was immediately apparent. Wilson's head was missing. The discovery transformed an already disturbing investigation into something far more difficult to understand. This was not simply a shooting in which the killer had fled. Someone had deliberately removed the victim's head. 4 days later, detectives discovered a wooden box in an alley. Inside was Wilson's head, wrapped in a pair of jeans and the pink Daddy's Girl t-shirt associated with Marnette Comer. The discovery created a physical link between Wilson and Comer that investigators could not ignore. Marnette Comer had disappeared wearing a shirt with those words. Now that same shirt had been found with the head of another murder victim. The connection was not based on rumor or a speculative theory. It was an object that physically linked two women who had died under violent circumstances. The ammunition created another link. Wilson had also been shot with .25 caliber ammunition. Suddenly, the investigation contained multiple overlapping elements. Women encountered around Sunset Boulevard, bodies abandoned in different places, .25 caliber ammunition, and now clothing connecting two victims. Investigators still needed to determine whether one person was responsible or whether several. Unrelated offenders were using similar methods. The answer would begin to emerge through Carol Bundy. According to Bundy's later testimony, Clark returned to their apartment during the early morning hours of June 23rd, around 4:30 or 5:00 a.m. He told her that he had just killed two women. One of them was Exie Wilson. According to Bundy's account, Clark had encountered Wilson and killed her. He then brought Wilson's severed head back to the apartment. Bundy later admitted that she became involved in what happened next. She helped handle the head and participated in preparing it for disposal. The head was eventually placed in a wooden box, and the box was discarded in an alley. The details were horrifying, but they were also significant for investigators because Bundy was describing events that corresponded to physical evidence already recovered. The box existed. Wilson's head existed. The clothing existed. The ammunition existed. And Bundy's account provided a narrative connecting those objects to Clark. Still, Bundy's credibility would become one of the central issues surrounding the case. She was not an innocent observer. She had participated in concealing evidence, and she would eventually admit that she herself had killed Jack Murray. Her testimony, therefore, had to be evaluated carefully. The prosecution could not simply ask a jury to believe her because she claimed Clark was responsible. Instead, her statements needed to be compared against the independent evidence, ballistic evidence, telephone records, physical traces, vehicles, witness accounts, and Clark's own words and behavior. As detectives followed the trail, another disturbing element emerged from the relationship between Clark and Bundy. Their connection was not simply romantic. According to evidence later presented in court, the couple had discussed and developed fantasies involving extreme sexual behavior, including fantasies involving dead bodies. The prosecution would later argue that these fantasies were relevant to understanding the motive and character of the crimes. But in June 1980, investigators were still assembling fragments. They knew that women were dying. They knew that .25 caliber ammunition appeared repeatedly. They knew that someone was making strange calls to people connected with the victims. They knew that one victim's clothing had been found with another victim's remains. And they were beginning to hear a story from a woman who claimed that her lover had been responsible. The problem was that the story was coming from someone who was herself involved in the aftermath of the violence that made the investigation both more promising and more complicated. The question was no longer simply whether Carol Bundy was telling the truth. The question was how much of her story could be independently verified. The answer would come gradually, through evidence that existed outside her testimony. The telephone records could place calls. The bullets could point toward a weapon. The weapon could be traced to a place associated with Clark. A garage could contain physical traces. Witnesses could describe Clark's movements and statements. And eventually, Clark's own writings would provide investigators with another unexpected source of information. The investigation was therefore moving away from a single accusation and toward a chain of evidence. Each link mattered because any one piece could be challenged. But if enough independent links pointed in the same direction, the overall picture would become increasingly difficult to explain. By the end of June, Los Angeles had not yet fully identified the man who would eventually be convicted of 6 murders. But the city was getting closer, and somewhere within the relationship between Douglas Clark and Carol Bundy was the information that would eventually connect the scattered bodies. The telephone calls, the guns, and the hidden evidence into one case. By the end of June 1980, the investigation into the murders around Los Angeles was no longer a collection of isolated deaths. The names of the victims were beginning to form a grim sequence. Marnette Comer, Cynthia Chandler, Gina Morano, Karen Jones, and Exie Wilson. Their circumstances were not identical, but several details continued to overlap. Young and vulnerable women had disappeared or been encountered around Sunset Boulevard. Some had been shot with .25 caliber ammunition. Bodies had been abandoned in locations away from where the killings may have occurred. And in the case of Exie Wilson, the discovery of her head in a wooden box had created an unmistakable physical connection to another victim, Marnette Comer. Yet the investigation still lacked the single element that could explain how all these pieces fit together. That element was beginning to emerge from the testimony of Carol Bundy. Bundy was not simply a witness who had heard a rumor about Douglas Clark. She was his lover, and she had been living within the same unstable relationship that investigators were now beginning to examine. Her knowledge of Clark's activities was therefore unusually intimate. But it also created an immediate problem. If Bundy accused Clark, how much of what she said could be trusted? She had reasons to protect herself. She had been involved in the handling of Exie Wilson's remains. She had purchased the guns, and eventually, she would admit that she had committed a murder herself. Her story had to be examined against evidence that existed independently of her. According to Bundy's account, Clark returned to their apartment in the early morning of June 23rd. Around 4:30 or 5:00 a.m., he told her that he had just killed 2 women. One of those women was Exie Wilson. The timing was significant because Wilson and Karen Jones had been killed during the same period of the early morning hours. Bundy said that Clark described encountering Wilson and killing her. He then brought Wilson's severed head back to the apartment. What happened next became one of the most disturbing elements of the case. Bundy admitted that she participated in the handling of Wilson's remains. She helped deal with the head and became involved in preparing it for disposal. A wooden box was obtained. The head was placed inside, together with the clothing that investigators would later recover. The box was then taken away and discarded. When detectives eventually found the box in an alley, the physical evidence gave Bundy's story a disturbing point of comparison. She was not describing an imaginary object. The box existed. Wilson's head was inside it. The clothing was there, and the pink Daddy's Girl shirt connected the remains to Marnette Comer. For investigators, this meant that Bundy's account could be tested against facts that had already been established. That did not automatically make every part of her testimony true, but it gave detectives a way to determine whether her story corresponded to evidence. The shirt was especially important. Marnette Comer had disappeared wearing a pink t-shirt with the words Daddy's Girl. Her body was later found near Foothill Boulevard. Now that shirt had been recovered with Wilson's head. The object therefore represented a connection between 2 victims. It was one of the kinds of details that could not easily be explained as a random coincidence. The ammunition offered another connection. Wilson had been shot with .25 caliber ammunition, just as several other victims had been. Investigators were beginning to see a pattern in which the same type of weapon might have been used repeatedly. But the most powerful physical evidence would come later, when investigators recovered one of the Raven pistols associated with Clark and conducted ballistic examinations. Before that development, however, the investigation continued to gather information from people who had crossed paths with Clark. The strange telephone calls became particularly important. After the murders of Chandler and Morano, someone had contacted people connected to the victims while pretending to be a police investigator. The calls were disturbing because the caller appeared to know information about the killings. On June 22nd, Mindy Cohen received such a call. Then, on July 24th, she received another. This time, the caller claimed responsibility for the deaths of Chandler and Morano and threatened Cohen with becoming the next victim. Cohen contacted police. Investigators examined the telephone records and found that the July 24th call had been made from the Verdugo Street apartment used by Clark and Bundy at approximately 7:11 in the morning. Clark left for work at approximately 7:28, and his workplace was only a few minutes away. A telephone record could not, by itself, establish everything that had happened inside the apartment, but it created a specific, objective fact that investigators could place alongside the testimony of witnesses and the other evidence. The person responsible for the threatening call had used a location associated with Clark shortly before Clark went to work. Investigators also had to consider Clark's behavior after the killings became public. He followed reports about the murders and demonstrated an unusual interest in information concerning the victims. His later writings would become even more significant, but already there were signs that he knew more about the cases than he would have needed to know if he were simply an uninvolved member of the public. At the same time, investigators were examining the relationship between Clark and Bundy. Their relationship had developed rapidly after they met in late 1979. By 1980, their lives had become intertwined with sexual fantasies that, according to evidence later presented in court, included necrophilia and other extreme themes. This information was disturbing not merely because of its content, but because it provided a possible context for understanding why the deaths of the victims might have become part of Clark's behavior. The prosecution would later use evidence of Clark's statements and interests to establish motive and intent. Yet investigators still needed to distinguish between fantasy and actual criminal conduct. A person could say disturbing things without committing murder. Therefore, the evidence had to move beyond what Clark had allegedly said. It needed to connect him physically to the crimes. The garage became one such location. Clark had rented a garage, and investigators later discovered dark stains on the concrete floor that appeared consistent with blood. One particularly large stain extended approximately 2.5 feet by 8 feet and appeared consistent with something having been dragged across the floor. Investigators also found a shoe impression. The impression was consistent with the sole of the boots Clark was wearing when he was taken into custody. Again, the garage evidence did not exist in isolation. A stain that appeared to be blood could raise questions about where it came from. A shoe impression could potentially be challenged. But when these findings were considered together with the ammunition, the weapons, the telephone records, and Bundy's testimony, they became part of a broader evidentiary chain. The investigation was gradually changing character. Detectives were no longer depending on a single witness to explain the murders. Instead, they were assembling independent pieces that could support or contradict individual statements. And the more they examined Clark's activities, the more difficult it became to treat the killings as unrelated incidents. Yet the case still contained an extraordinary complication. Carol Bundy was not merely pointing toward Clark. She was moving closer to the center of the criminal story herself. Her relationship with Jack Murray was one reason. Murray had been the manager of the apartment complex where Bundy had lived, and he had also been romantically involved with her. Bundy eventually told Murray about what she knew concerning Clark and the murders. According to the evidence, Murray appeared to pose a threat because he might report what he had learned. Bundy's response was not to seek protection or contact police. Instead, she killed him. She shot Murray, then took steps to conceal the crime, including dismembering his body and removing his head. Clark also became involved in the handling of Murray's remains. This killing was different from the earlier murders in one crucial respect. It would become the event that finally brought Bundy into direct contact with law enforcement. On August 11, 1980, Carol Bundy called police and confessed to killing Jack Murray. But her confession did not end with Murray. She began telling investigators about Douglas Clark and his involvement in the killings of women around Los Angeles. Suddenly, the investigation had a source from inside the relationship itself. Bundy could describe what she claimed Clark had told her, what she had seen, and what she had helped conceal. But detectives still faced the same question. Could her story be independently verified? The answer would emerge from the evidence already gathered and from evidence that investigators had yet to uncover. The weapon would become crucial. The garage would become important. Telephone records would provide an objective timeline. Witnesses would describe Clark's behavior. And Clark's own writings would eventually give investigators another unexpected window into what he knew. The case was no longer simply about whether Carol Bundy was telling the truth. It was about whether the physical world, the bullets, the gun, the vehicles, the telephone calls, the garage, the clothing, and the written records would tell the same story. If they did, the investigation would have something far stronger than an accusation. It would have a chain of evidence leading back to Douglas Clark. And as investigators continued following that chain, the woman who had once shared Clark's life was becoming the person who could help dismantle the story he wanted them to believe. By August 1980, the investigation had reached a turning point. For weeks, detectives had been trying to understand whether the murders of several young women were connected. There were bodies, .25 caliber bullets, strange telephone calls, unusual evidence from a garage, and the increasingly disturbing testimony of Carol Bundy. But there was still no single event that had completely opened the case. That changed on August 11th, when Bundy walked into the investigation herself. She contacted police and confessed to killing Jack Murray. Murray had been more than an acquaintance. He had been the manager of the apartment complex where Bundy had lived, and he had also been romantically involved with her. According to the evidence presented later, Bundy had told Murray about what she knew concerning Clark and the murders. Murray appeared to represent a danger to her because he could potentially reveal what he had learned. Instead of allowing him to go to the police, Bundy killed him. She shot Murray and then took steps to conceal the crime, including dismembering his body and removing his head. The confession, therefore, did not come from an innocent bystander who had merely witnessed Clark's actions. It came from a woman who had committed a homicide herself and had participated in concealing human remains. That fact would remain central to any evaluation of her credibility. Yet her confession also provided investigators with something they had not possessed before: an insider's account of the relationship between Bundy and Douglas Clark and a possible explanation for several unsolved murders. Bundy began telling investigators that Clark was responsible for the killings of women around Los Angeles. She described conversations, movements, weapons, vehicles, and events that she claimed had occurred between herself and Clark. Some of the information concerned details that could be compared with evidence already collected. Other information pointed detectives toward evidence that they had not yet discovered. This distinction was critical. A confession or accusation can be challenged. A physical object that independently corresponds to the story is harder to dismiss. Investigators, therefore, had to separate what Bundy personally knew from what she might have learned through newspapers or other public sources. They also had to determine whether she was attempting to shift responsibility away from herself. Bundy had a powerful reason to protect herself. She had already admitted to killing Murray. She had also acknowledged participating in the disposal of Exie Wilson's remains. If she could portray Clark as the principal killer, she could potentially reduce the perception of her own responsibility. The detective's task was therefore not simply to believe her. It was to test her. One of the first major areas of verification involved the weapons. Months earlier, Bundy had purchased 2 Raven pistols chambered for .25 caliber ammunition. According to her account, Clark had selected the guns and asked her to buy them because he could not purchase them himself. Clark had access to the weapons and had used them. Eventually, investigators recovered the Raven pistol associated with Clark from a place connected to his employment. They then examined the ballistic evidence from the murders. The results became one of the strongest physical links in the entire case. The bullets recovered from the victims were determined to have been fired from the nickel-plated Raven found at Clark's workplace. This changed the nature of the investigation. The prosecution no longer needed to rely entirely on Bundy's word that Clark had access to a .25 caliber weapon. The ammunition recovered from the victims could be linked to a specific firearm associated with Clark. The chain was becoming more concrete. Victims, bullets, weapon, and suspect. The importance of this evidence becomes clearer when viewed alongside the circumstances of the killings. Cynthia Chandler and Gina Morano had both been shot with .25 caliber ammunition. Karen Jones had also been shot with a .25 caliber bullet. Exie Wilson had been shot with the same caliber. Marnette Comer had been shot repeatedly, with .25 caliber ammunition identified in connection with the case. Jane Doe 18, whose remains were discovered later near the water towers in Antelope Valley, had also been shot in the back of the head with a .25 caliber bullet. The recurring ammunition did not, by itself, prove that the same person had killed every victim. But once the bullets were associated with a particular Raven pistol connected to Clark, the repeated caliber became far more significant. Investigators were also examining the vehicles associated with Clark and Bundy. According to the evidence, Clark used Bundy's vehicles, including a Buick station wagon and a smaller Datsun. Several victims were believed to have been picked up in vehicles associated with the couple. The vehicles mattered because they provided a possible bridge between the public setting of Sunset Boulevard and the private locations where some of the killings may have occurred. A woman could be approached on the street, invited into a vehicle, and then disappear from public view. Her body might later be found somewhere entirely different. That pattern helped explain why investigators had initially struggled to connect the cases. The killing site and the body disposal site did not necessarily appear to be the same place. The garage was another important part of this emerging picture. Investigators examined a garage Clark had rented and found dark stains on the concrete floor. One area extended approximately 2.5 feet by 8 feet and appeared consistent with a bloodstain or with a blood-covered object having been dragged across the floor. A shoe impression was also found. The impression was consistent with the sole of the boots Clark was wearing when he was arrested. None of these details, standing alone, could answer every question. A stain that appeared to be blood required interpretation. A shoe impression could indicate presence without necessarily proving what happened there. But the evidence was not being considered separately. It was being compared with the statements provided by Bundy and the physical evidence from the murder scenes. The same investigative principle applied to the telephone calls. The threatening call received by Mindy Cohen on July 24th had been traced to the Verdugo Street apartment used by Clark and Bundy. The call was placed at approximately 7:11 a.m. Clark went to work at approximately 7:28, with his workplace only minutes away. Again, the telephone record did not reveal everything about the caller, but it placed the call at a location associated with Clark during a narrow period of time. Investigators now had multiple forms of evidence that pointed in the same direction. The case was becoming less dependent on any single witness. There was also the question of Clark's own statements and writings. After his arrest, Clark produced numerous letters and documents concerning the case. He attempted to influence how other people described events. He wanted Bundy to accept responsibility for the murders and to place greater blame on Jack Murray. He also communicated with Veronica Lynn Compton, providing material and discussing ideas connected with the case. Instead of helping him, some of these writings became evidence against him because they demonstrated that he possessed knowledge about details of the murders. Clark attempted to control the narrative from inside custody, but his efforts created another problem for him. The more he wrote, the more information investigators could examine. Some of the details in his writings concerned matters that, according to prosecutors, were not information an uninvolved person should have possessed. The prosecution would later argue that this knowledge supported the conclusion that Clark was not merely following the murders through newspaper reports. By this stage, the investigation had developed several independent lines of evidence. Bundy provided an insider account. Ballistics connected the murder bullets to a specific Raven pistol. Telephone records placed suspicious calls at an apartment associated with Clark. The garage contained physical traces consistent with the prosecution's theory. Vehicles connected Clark and Bundy to the environment in which victims had been approached. Witnesses described Clark's statements and behavior, and Clark's own writing supplied additional information about the murders. Yet one major question remained unresolved. Exactly how many victims could be attributed to Clark beyond the cases that investigators could prove? There were suspicions of additional killings, but suspicion was not the same as a criminal conviction. The prosecution would ultimately focus on 6 murders that it believed could be established beyond a reasonable doubt. Those 6 victims were Marnette Comer, Cynthia Chandler, Gina Morano, Karen Jones, Exie Wilson, and Jane Doe 18. Before the case could reach its final legal stage, however, investigators still had to reconstruct the individual killings and demonstrate how the evidence connected Clark to each one. That meant returning to the victims themselves, examining their final known movements, and comparing Bundy's account with the physical evidence. It also meant confronting the defense that Clark would eventually present, that Bundy and Jack Murray were the real killers and that he had been framed. The coming courtroom battle would therefore depend on more than whether Clark could deny the accusations. It would depend on whether the prosecution could demonstrate that the separate pieces of evidence formed a coherent and reliable chain. By August 1980, that chain was becoming difficult to ignore. The confession that began with Jack Murray had opened a door. Behind it was a much larger investigation, one involving multiple victims, 2 lovers, 2 Raven pistols, a garage, threatening telephone calls, hidden remains, and a series of statements that would eventually be placed before a jury. Carol Bundy had entered the police station to confess to 1 killing. In doing so, she had exposed a story that investigators believed could explain several others. Now, they had to determine exactly how much of that story was true and how much could be proven, without relying on her alone. By the time investigators began assembling the case against Douglas Clark, the story no longer depended on a single confession. Carol Bundy remained central, but detectives understood that her credibility would inevitably be attacked. She had admitted killing Jack Murray. She had acknowledged helping Clark deal with Exie Wilson's remains. She had been emotionally involved with Clark. She therefore had reasons to protect herself. And a defense attorney could argue that she was simply transferring responsibility to the man she had been involved with. For the investigators, the challenge was clear. If Bundy's story was going to become the foundation of a murder prosecution, it had to be supported by evidence that existed independently of her. One of the most important pieces was the firearm evidence. Months before the killings, in April 1980, Bundy had purchased 2 Raven .25 caliber pistols from a pawnshop in Van Nuys. According to Bundy's account, Clark had selected the weapons and asked her to buy them because he could not purchase them himself. The significance of those weapons only became apparent after investigators recovered and nickel-plated Raven connected to Clark. The weapon was hidden at his place of employment. Investigators submitted it for ballistic examination and compared it with ammunition recovered from the murder scenes. The results were devastating for Clark's defense. The bullets recovered from the victims were determined to have been fired from that particular Raven. In a case where the accused could claim that another person had committed the killings, the firearm provided a physical connection that did not depend upon Bundy's memory. A witness could be mistaken. A former lover could lie. But a firearm leaves microscopic characteristics on bullets, and those characteristics could be compared with the recovered weapon. The evidence did not exist in isolation. Cynthia Chandler and Gina Morano had been shot with .25 caliber ammunition. Karen Jones had been shot in the head with a .25 caliber bullet. Exie Wilson had also been shot with a .25 caliber bullet. Marnette Comer had been shot repeatedly with .25 caliber ammunition associated with the case. Jane Doe 18 had been shot in the back of the head, and a .25 caliber bullet was recovered in connection with her remains. The repeated appearance of the same caliber already suggested a possible relationship between the murders. The ballistic examination gave that pattern a specific object, the Raven associated with Clark. Another part of the investigation concerned the garage Clark had rented. Detectives found dark stains on the concrete floor. One large area extended approximately 2.5 feet by 8 feet, resembling a bloodstain or the path left by a blood-covered object being dragged across the floor. A shoe impression was also recovered. Investigators compared the impression with the boots Clark had been wearing when arrested and found the tread consistent with his footwear. Again, the garage evidence had to be interpreted carefully. A stain did not automatically establish that a particular victim had been killed there. A shoe impression could establish someone's presence without explaining what had happened. But investigators were not trying to prove the case through the garage alone. They were looking for pieces that could corroborate the larger account. If Bundy said that bodies had been taken to a garage, and the garage contained suspicious stains and a shoe impression consistent with Clark's boots, that information became relevant. If the same investigation also produced a firearm linked to the murder bullets, telephone records connected to Clark's apartment, and witnesses describing Clark's behavior, the combined significance increased. The telephone evidence was another example of an apparently ordinary record becoming important. On July 24th, Mindy Cohen received a threatening call from a man who claimed to have killed Cynthia Chandler and Gina Morano. The caller told Cohen that she could become the next victim. Cohen reported the call to police. Investigators determined that the call had been made at approximately 7:11 in the morning from the Verdugo Street apartment used by Clark and Bundy. Clark left for work at approximately 7:28. His workplace was only a few minutes away. The timing mattered because it narrowed the opportunity for the call and placed it at a location associated with Clark shortly before he went to work. Investigators also considered earlier telephone contacts. On June 16th, a man claiming to be a police officer contacted Lori Briggs in connection with the murders of Chandler and Morano. The caller appeared to know details about the case and was interested in people connected to the victims. The voice was later identified as Clark's by a witness. The significance of the calls was not simply that someone had made them. It was that the caller appeared unusually interested in the victims and people connected with them. The July 24th call was even more troubling because it moved from impersonation and questioning to an explicit threat. Clark's alleged telephone behavior, therefore, became another part of the prosecution's effort to show his continuing interest in the murders. Investigators also examined Clark's movements and his access to vehicles. Bundy owned vehicles that Clark used, including a blue Buick station wagon and a smaller Datsun. According to the evidence, Clark frequently used the vehicles while moving through the areas where prostitutes and other vulnerable women could be found. The vehicles were important because several accounts placed victims in cars before their deaths. The prosecution's theory was that Clark could approach women on Sunset Boulevard, persuade or pressure them to enter a vehicle, and then move them away from the public street. That would help explain why some bodies were discovered far from the places where the women were last seen. The distinction between the place where someone disappeared, the place where they were killed, and the place where their body was eventually found became increasingly important. Investigators were reconstructing a sequence rather than searching for one traditional crime scene. In some cases, the bodies had been left in public or semi-public areas. In others, remains were discovered in isolated locations. The discovery of Exie Wilson's head illustrated just how deliberately evidence could be moved. Wilson's body and head were separated. Her head was eventually found inside a wooden box in an alley, wrapped with clothing that included the pink Daddy's Girl t-shirt associated with Marnette Comer. That clothing connection was particularly significant because it linked two victims through an object that had no obvious reason to appear with the remains of another woman. According to Bundy's account, Clark had brought Wilson's head to the apartment. Bundy said she participated in handling it and later helped place it into a box before it was discarded. This testimony was horrifying, but from an investigative perspective, it was also testable. Investigators could compare Bundy's description with the location where the box was discovered and with the clothing recovered from it. The case therefore continued to develop through a process of comparison, what Bundy said, what the physical evidence showed, and what Clark himself had said or written. Clark's own writings would become another unexpected problem for the defense. After his arrest, he produced numerous letters and documents concerning the investigation. He attempted to persuade others to support his version of events. One of his apparent strategies was to place responsibility on Bundy and Jack Murray, suggesting that they were the real killers. He also communicated with Veronica Lynn Compton and supplied material connected to the case. But some of his writings contained information that prosecutors argued was difficult to explain if Clark had truly been uninvolved. His knowledge of certain details concerning victims and crime scenes became part of the prosecution's case. The irony was significant. Clark was attempting to control the story, but every written statement created another record investigators could examine. Instead of disappearing into the background, he was leaving behind his own words. By this stage, the case had become a network of evidence rather than a single accusation. Bundy's testimony pointed toward Clark. The Raven connected bullets to a weapon associated with him. The telephone records placed suspicious calls at his residence. The garage contained physical evidence consistent with the prosecution's theory. Vehicles linked Clark to the environment in which victims had been approached. Witnesses described his statements and behavior. His own writings revealed knowledge of the investigation. None of these elements answered every question by itself. Together, however, they formed the structure that prosecutors would eventually present to a jury. The next challenge was to place the individual victims inside that structure. 6 names would ultimately stand at the center of the murder case: Marnette Comer, Cynthia Chandler, Gina Morano, Karen Jones, Exie Wilson, and Jane Doe 18. Each had a separate life, a separate disappearance, and a separate final journey. Their stories could easily have remained isolated incidents scattered across Los Angeles. The investigation's task was to demonstrate that they were not. As detectives continued reconstructing the murders, the central question became increasingly precise. Could the prosecution prove that the same man who possessed the Raven, used the vehicles, made the suspicious calls, knew the victim's circumstances, and was described by Bundy was also responsible for the 6 deaths? That question would eventually be answered in court. But before the jury could reach a verdict, prosecutors would have to reconstruct the victim's final hours and show how each murder fit into the larger pattern. The case was moving away from the uncertainty of the first weeks and toward a courtroom confrontation in which every piece of evidence would be challenged, examined, and weighed. As investigators continued reconstructing the Sunset Strip killings, the case became more than a question of whether Douglas Clark had possessed a particular firearm or made suspicious telephone calls. The prosecution would eventually have to establish something much larger: that 6 separate deaths belonged to one connected pattern, and that Clark was responsible for each of them. At the center of that reconstruction were the victims themselves. Marnette Comer, Cynthia Chandler, Gina Morano, Karen Jones, Exie Wilson, and Jane Doe 18 were not simply names in a case file. Each had been living a separate life before disappearing, and each entered the investigation through a different set of circumstances. Their vulnerability was one of the recurring characteristics of the case. Several were young women, women living unstable lives, or women working as prostitutes. That circumstance would later become important because investigators believed Clark used the environment around Sunset Boulevard and Hollywood to encounter women who might be easier to approach, and whose disappearances might not immediately produce the same level of public attention as those of women with stable homes and close family networks. Marnette Comer was among the earliest victims associated with the case. She was a young woman who had been living a transient life, and her sister Sabra saw her for the last time around May 21st, 1980. Marnette was wearing a pink t-shirt bearing the words, "Daddy's Girl." She disappeared, and more than a month passed before her body was found. On June 30th, her nude body was discovered in a ravine near Foothill Boulevard. She had been dead for some time. The medical examination showed that she had been shot several times in the chest, including with .25 caliber ammunition. The significance of Marnette's clothing would not become clear immediately. It was only later, when investigators recovered the severed head of Exie Wilson, that the pink Daddy's Girl shirt became a startling connection between two victims. The shirt had been found with Wilson's head. That meant an object associated with one missing woman had appeared with the remains of another. It was a physical link that investigators could not easily dismiss. The deaths of Cynthia Chandler and Gina Morano created another stage in the investigation. Chandler was 16 years old. Morano was 15. The two were related through their mother and were found together on June 12, 1980, near a freeway ramp beside Forest Lawn Cemetery. Their bodies had been left in an area away from where they had apparently encountered their killer. The medical evidence showed that Morano had been shot in the head, while Chandler had been shot in both the head and chest. The ammunition was .25 caliber. Their bodies appeared to have been there for at least approximately 12 hours before discovery, and the absence of a large amount of blood at the location suggested that they may have been killed somewhere else and transported to the place where they were found. That distinction became important because it offered investigators a possible explanation for the changing locations of the bodies. If the victims were being killed somewhere other than where they were discovered, then the killer had access to a vehicle and enough control over the situation to move the bodies after death. According to Bundy's later testimony, Clark had told her about the two girls. She said he had picked them up and that the situation had escalated after they entered a vehicle. Her account placed Clark directly into the events surrounding their deaths. But investigators still needed independent evidence, and the ammunition provided one of the strongest connections. The same .25 caliber ammunition appeared repeatedly in the murders. Then came Karen Jones and Exie Wilson. Their deaths occurred on June 23rd. Karen Jones was a prostitute who had been seen on Sunset Boulevard during the early morning hours. At approximately 2 o'clock, a patrol officer encountered her and warned her not to remain in the area for too long. Later, a resident reported hearing a woman scream. At approximately 3:15 in the morning, Jones's body was discovered along the roadside. She had been shot in the head with a .25 caliber bullet. The timing created an unsettling sequence. A police officer had seen Jones alive only a short time before her body was found. Somewhere between those two moments, she disappeared from the street and was killed. Investigators could therefore place a narrow window around the final events of her life. Exie Wilson was discovered separately, but her death became one of the most disturbing pieces of the entire investigation because her head was missing. Her body was found in a restaurant parking lot, while her head was discovered days later in a wooden box in an alley. The head had been wrapped in clothing, including the pink t-shirt associated with Marnette Comer. The bullet recovered from Wilson's head was also .25 caliber. This was no longer simply a collection of murders involving the same type of ammunition. Investigators were now confronted with a chain of physical associations connecting the victims to one another. According to Bundy, Clark returned to their apartment in the early morning hours of June 23rd and told her that he had killed two women. She said he described encountering Wilson and killing her. Bundy further stated that Clark brought Wilson's head back to the apartment. She acknowledged helping with the handling and disposal of the remains. Her participation meant that she could not present herself as an uninvolved observer. Yet her account also provided investigators with information that could be checked against physical evidence. The wooden box, the clothing, and the location where the head was eventually recovered all existed independently of her testimony. That distinction would become important when the defense later attacked her credibility. The final victim in the six-murder case was Jane Doe, 18, an unidentified young woman sometimes associated with the description Water Tower Jane Doe. Her remains were discovered on August 26th, after Clark had already been arrested. Workers inspecting an area near water towers in the Antelope Valley found the remains of a young woman whose identity was unknown. The examination indicated that she had been shot in the back of the head with a .25 caliber bullet. Bundy told investigators that Clark had previously described killing a prostitute whom he associated with a water tower. According to her account, he had picked up the woman in Hollywood taken her in a vehicle, and shot her before leaving her body near the water towers. The discovery of Jane Doe, 18, therefore provided investigators with another case that could be compared with Bundy's description. Again, the evidence was not presented as if her testimony alone established the murder. The .25 caliber ammunition and the circumstances surrounding the remains became part of the larger pattern. There was also a surviving victim whose testimony provided an important contrast to the 6 deaths. On April 27, 1980, before the murders for which Clark would ultimately receive death sentences, a woman identified in court as Charlene A. encountered Clark on Sunset Boulevard. According to her testimony, she entered his vehicle and was suddenly attacked with a knife. She fought back and managed to escape. Her survival meant that, unlike the murder victims, she could personally describe the man she said had attacked her. She later identified Clark. The case against him therefore included not only victims who could no longer speak, but also a surviving witness who could identify him and describe an alleged attack. Although the attempted murder and mayhem convictions connected to Charlene A. were later overturned by the California Supreme Court in 1992, her testimony remained part of the historical record of the prosecution. As the evidence accumulated, investigators also examined Clark's behavior toward women in the Sunset Boulevard environment. Witnesses described statements he had made about prostitution, sexual violence, and increasingly extreme sexual fantasies. One witness, Danielle Patton, described Clark discussing S&M and other violent sexual interests. Such statements did not by themselves prove that he had committed a particular murder, but prosecutors used them as evidence relevant to motive and intent. The prosecution's theory was that Clark's attraction to vulnerable women, his interest in prostitution, his access to firearms, and his fascination with violent sexual behavior formed part of the circumstances surrounding the killings. Yet the victims remained the most important part of the story. The physical evidence could connect bullets to a gun. Telephone records could connect calls to an apartment. A garage could contain suspicious stains. A witness could describe a conversation. But each piece of evidence ultimately pointed back to a human being who had disappeared and never returned home. By the time the investigation moved toward prosecution, the 6 murders could be arranged into a chronology that prosecutors believed demonstrated a consistent method. Women were encountered in or around the Sunset Boulevard area. Some were taken away in vehicles. Some were found in places far from where they had last been seen. Several had been shot with .25 caliber ammunition. Evidence connected that ammunition to the Raven associated with Clark, and Bundy's testimony provided a narrative linking Clark to the individual deaths. The defense would challenge that narrative at trial, but the prosecution now had something that had not existed at the beginning of the investigation, a pattern supported by multiple independent forms of evidence. The question was no longer simply who had killed one woman. It was whether the same pattern could be proven across 6 separate murders beyond a reasonable doubt. That would become the central battle when Douglas Clark finally faced a jury. By the time Douglas Clark became the central suspect in the Sunset Strip killings, investigators were no longer looking at a single unexplained murder. They were looking at a series of deaths that appeared increasingly connected by ammunition, vehicles, telephone calls, physical evidence, and the testimony of Carol Bundy. But suspicion was not enough. If Clark was to be prosecuted for 6 murders, investigators needed to establish a chain of evidence that could withstand the scrutiny of a courtroom. The investigation, therefore, moved away from the initial discovery of bodies and toward the quieter, more methodical work of connecting objects, locations, statements, and movements. One of the most important pieces of that work involved the firearms. In April 1980, Bundy had purchased 2 Raven pistols chambered in .25 caliber from a pawn shop in Van Nuys. According to Bundy's account, Clark had selected the guns first and then asked her to purchase them because he said he could not buy them himself. At the time, there was no obvious reason for anyone to connect those 2 small pistols to a future series of murders. But after the killings, the weapons became critical. Investigators eventually located 2 Raven .25 caliber pistols concealed at Clark's workplace. The weapon that became especially significant was the nickel-plated Raven. Ballistics testing connected the weapon to the bullets recovered from the victims. The significance of this evidence was enormous. A witness could be mistaken. A former lover could have a motive to shift blame. A suspect could deny an accusation. But a firearm leaves a physical signature through the ammunition it fires. Investigators determined that the bullets recovered from the victims had been fired from the Raven. Associated with Clark, this did not exist in isolation. It connected the victims to a specific weapon and the weapon to Clark. The prosecution could therefore present a chain that did not depend entirely upon Bundy's credibility. Victims had been shot with .25 caliber ammunition. The ammunition was linked through ballistic examination to a particular Raven. That weapon had been concealed at Clark's workplace, and Bundy had previously explained how the firearms had entered their lives. Another important part of the investigation involved the garage Clark had rented. Investigators examining the location discovered dark stains on the concrete floor that appeared consistent with blood. One particularly significant area extended approximately 2.5 feet by 8 feet and looked as though something bearing blood had been dragged across the floor. A shoe impression was also discovered. Investigators compared the impression with the footwear Clark was wearing when he was arrested and found that it was consistent with the soles of his boots. The garage evidence did not, by itself, tell investigators exactly which victim had been there or precisely what had happened. That limitation was important. A stain suspected to be blood could not simply be transformed into a complete murder narrative. But the garage became another piece in a growing collection of evidence. The same investigation was also examining Clark's use of vehicles. Bundy had access to a blue Buick station wagon and a small Datsun. And according to her testimony, Clark used the vehicles while interacting with women around Sunset Boulevard. The prosecution's theory was that some victims were picked up in or around Hollywood and then taken elsewhere. That would help explain why bodies were discovered at locations different from the places where the women were last seen. The physical locations, therefore, became another part of the reconstruction. Sunset Boulevard was not necessarily the place where a murder occurred. It could be the place where a victim first encountered Clark. A vehicle could then become the bridge between the street and a more private location. A garage or another secluded area could become the place where violence occurred. Finally, the body could be transported again and abandoned somewhere else. This pattern was particularly significant in the cases of Cynthia Chandler and Gina Morano. Their bodies were found near a freeway ramp beside Forest Lawn Cemetery, and the absence of a large quantity of blood at the discovery location suggested that they may have been killed elsewhere. The same general issue arose with Marnette Comer, whose body was found in a ravine near Foothill Boulevard, and with Jane Doe 18, whose remains were discovered near water towers in the Antelope Valley. Investigators were gradually building a picture of movement rather than a single fixed crime scene. The telephone evidence provided another unexpected connection. After Chandler and Morano were found, a man began making calls to people connected with the victims. One of the recipients was Lori Briggs. The caller claimed to be a police officer investigating the murders. The circumstances of the call were unusual enough to attract attention, particularly because the caller appeared to know details about the case. Then came the call to Mindy Cohen. On June 22nd, Cohen received a call from a man who identified himself as an investigator and knew about the deaths of Chandler and Morano. On July 24th, she received another call. This time, according to the information presented in the case, the caller claimed responsibility for the murders and threatened Cohen, saying that she could become the next victim. Cohen contacted police. Investigators were able to examine telephone records and determine that the July 24th call had originated from the Verdugo Street apartment used by Clark and Bundy. The call was placed at approximately 7:11 in the morning. Clark reportedly left for work at about 7:28, and his workplace was only a few minutes away. That narrow window was significant because it placed Clark at a location connected to the threatening call shortly before he left for work. A witness later identified the caller's voice as Clark's. The telephone evidence, therefore, became another independent strand of the investigation. It was not simply that Clark knew about the murders. His voice was associated with calls made to people connected to the victims, and at least one threatening call could be traced to the apartment he used. Investigators also examined Clark's personal belongings and written material. In his wallet, they found a piece of paper containing names and telephone numbers, including information associated with Mindy Cohen and references to women connected to the investigation. At the apartment, investigators found newspaper reports about the murders. Clark had retained material concerning the case, including coverage of the discovery of the box containing Exie Wilson's head. On its own, reading newspaper reports about a notorious murder would not be proof of guilt. Many people follow sensational cases, but investigators were interested in the combination of those articles with Clark's other knowledge and behavior. The most unusual evidence came later, after Clark had already been arrested. Rather than remaining silent, he wrote extensively about the case. He attempted to influence what other people would say and tried to construct an alternative explanation for the murders. He wanted Bundy to place greater responsibility on Jack Murray. In his correspondence, Clark discussed the case in ways prosecutors believed revealed knowledge that went beyond what an uninvolved person should have possessed. Some of the written material contained references to details surrounding the victims, their clothing, locations, and circumstances. The prosecution argued that Clark's own writings were revealing because they demonstrated his continuing effort to control the narrative. He was not simply denying the killings. He was attempting to shape the testimony of people around him. That behavior became particularly important when investigators compared his statements with the physical evidence already collected. The case was therefore developing along several parallel lines. Bundy provided an insider account. Ballistics connected bullets to the Raven. Telephone records connected calls to the apartment. Witnesses described Clark's behavior and statements. The garage contained suspicious stains and a shoe impression consistent with his footwear. Vehicles associated with Bundy and used by Clark provided another possible link between the victims. Last known movements and the places where their bodies were found. Clark's own writings added another layer by showing that, even after his arrest, he possessed information and was attempting to influence the story surrounding the murders. None of these elements existed in a vacuum. Their strength came from their convergence. Investigators were not being asked to believe only one person. They were being asked to consider whether all of these separate pieces could reasonably point toward anyone other than Clark. And as the evidence accumulated, one fact became increasingly difficult to escape. The investigation had moved far beyond the original accusation made by Carol Bundy. What had begun with one woman confessing to the murder of Jack Murray had opened a much larger investigation, one in which the authorities could now place physical evidence, telephone records, firearms, locations, witnesses, and Clark's own words alongside Bundy's testimony. The next stage would be the courtroom, where Clark would have an opportunity to challenge each of those pieces and present his own explanation for what had happened. For the prosecution, however, the investigation had reached its critical point. The question was no longer whether there was evidence. There was evidence in abundance. The question was whether that evidence, taken together, could convince 12 jurors that Douglas Clark was responsible for 6 murders beyond a reasonable doubt. By the time Douglas Clark's case reached trial, the prosecution had assembled a story that stretched across several months, multiple victims, different locations, and a complicated relationship between Clark and Carol Bundy. But a courtroom required more than a disturbing story. The prosecution had to prove 6 separate murders beyond a reasonable doubt. The defense, meanwhile, had a clear strategy: attack the credibility of Bundy, challenge the interpretation of the physical evidence, and persuade the jury that the woman who had confessed to killing Jack Murray was actually responsible for the murders attributed to Clark. At the center of the defense was a simple proposition. Clark denied being the killer. He maintained that Bundy and Jack Murray were the people responsible for the murders, and that Bundy had turned against him in order to protect herself. It was an argument that could not simply be dismissed because Bundy had accused him. Bundy had a criminal role of her own. She had admitted killing Murray. She had admitted participating in the handling of Exie Wilson's remains. She had been Clark's lover and had shared an unstable relationship with him. From the defense perspective, those facts created a powerful reason to question everything she said. If Bundy was willing to lie about one part of the story, the defense could argue, why should the jury believe her about the rest? The prosecution, therefore, had to do something crucial: demonstrate that Bundy's account was supported by evidence that existed outside her testimony. That was where the physical evidence became particularly important. The .25 caliber ammunition was one of the strongest links. The murders repeatedly involved .25 caliber bullets, and investigators had connected the bullets recovered from the victims to the nickel-plated Raven found concealed at Clark's workplace. The defense could question how the gun came into Clark's possession, how it had been used, and what Bundy's role had been in acquiring the firearms. But the ballistic evidence remained a tangible connection between the weapon and the killings. The prosecution could also point to the history of the two Raven pistols. Bundy had purchased them in April 1980 after, according to her testimony, Clark selected the weapons and asked her to buy them because he could not purchase them himself. That placed the firearms in the relationship before the murders occurred. The prosecution could therefore present the weapon evidence as part of a chronological sequence, rather than an isolated discovery made after the fact. Another important issue was the garage. Investigators had found suspicious dark stains on the concrete floor, including an area approximately 2.5 feet by 8 feet that appeared consistent with something bloody having been dragged across the surface. A shoe impression was also found, and it was consistent with the soles of Clark's boots. Again, the defense could argue that the evidence did not establish exactly what had happened inside the garage. The stains did not carry a label identifying a victim, and the shoe impression did not by itself prove that Clark had killed anyone there. But prosecutors did not need every piece of evidence to prove the entire case independently. They needed the evidence to form a coherent whole. The garage was another physical location associated with Clark that could potentially explain how victims might have been handled before their bodies were transported elsewhere. The telephone evidence provided a different kind of connection. After Cynthia Chandler and Gina Morano were found dead, people connected with the girls began receiving strange calls. A man claimed to be a police investigator. He appeared to know information concerning the murders. Mindy Cohen later received another call on July 24th. According to the case evidence, the caller claimed responsibility for the killings and threatened her. Cohen contacted police. Investigators traced the call to the Verdugo Street apartment used by Clark and Bundy. The call occurred at approximately 7:11 in the morning. Clark left for work at approximately 7:28, and his workplace was only a few minutes away. A witness also identified the caller's voice as Clark's. For the prosecution, the significance was not simply that a threatening call had been made. It was that the call could be placed within a specific time and location associated with Clark. The defense could challenge the identification and interpretation, but the telephone record supplied something that testimony alone could not: an objective record showing where the call originated. The prosecution also introduced evidence concerning Clark's behavior and statements. Witnesses described his interest in prostitution and violent sexual fantasies. Danielle Patton, who knew Clark through a bar, testified about statements he had made concerning S&M, violence, and increasingly extreme sexual behavior. Clark had also spoken about finding new ways to experience sexual excitement. Such evidence required careful treatment. A person's disturbing fantasies do not automatically establish that the person committed murder. The prosecution therefore used these statements in the broader context of motive and intent rather than presenting them as a substitute for direct evidence. The connection between sexual violence and the murders was part of the prosecution's explanation of why Clark might have targeted vulnerable women encountered around Sunset Boulevard. The victims themselves also remained central to the case. Cynthia Chandler was 16. Gina Morano was 15. Marnette Comer was a young woman whose disappearance had left her family searching for answers. Karen Jones was found shortly after she had been seen by a patrol officer on Sunset Boulevard. Exie Wilson was discovered in circumstances that left her head separated from her body. Jane Doe 18 remained unidentified. Their stories were different, but several shared the same brutal element: .25 caliber gunfire. The prosecution argued that the repeated use of the same type of weapon, combined with the other evidence, demonstrated a pattern rather than coincidence. Then there was Carol Bundy herself. Her testimony supplied details that could not easily be reconstructed from physical evidence alone. She described Clark returning to the apartment after the killings. She described conversations about the victims. She described the handling of Wilson's remains. She described statements Clark allegedly made about other women. She also acknowledged her own role in the events. That admission was both a strength and a weakness for the prosecution. It made her testimony appear more damaging because she was not pretending to be innocent. But it also gave the defense an obvious reason to portray her as an unreliable witness trying to save herself. Clark's own behavior after his arrest became another battlefield. Rather than simply refusing to discuss the case, he wrote letters and documents attempting to influence the narrative. He tried to persuade people to support his version of events. He wanted responsibility shifted toward Bundy and Jack Murray. Yet prosecutors argued that some of his writings contained information about the murders that suggested a deeper knowledge of the crimes. His efforts to control what others said could therefore be presented as consciousness of guilt. The defense faced another problem: the existence of the surviving victim, Charlene A., before the murders for which Clark would receive death sentences. Charlene had survived an alleged attack after meeting him on Sunset Boulevard. She later identified Clark. Her account gave the prosecution an additional witness who could describe Clark's behavior toward a woman he encountered in the same environment. Yet this evidence also had legal limitations, and years later the California Supreme Court would overturn the attempted murder and mayhem convictions connected to Charlene's case. At the trial itself, however, her testimony formed part of the prosecution's broader portrayal of Clark's conduct. As the proceedings continued, the jury was faced with two competing narratives. The prosecution presented Clark as the central figure in a series of murders connected by ammunition, weapons, victims, locations, telephone calls, and statements. The defense presented him as a man who had become the target of a false accusation created by Bundy, a woman who had already admitted killing Murray and who had powerful reasons to protect herself. Neither side could rely on a single piece of evidence to settle the question. The prosecution had to persuade the jury that the different strands reinforced one another. The defense had to convince jurors that the apparent connections were either misunderstood or deliberately constructed to frame Clark. The courtroom therefore became the place where every part of the investigation was tested. A telephone call could be questioned. A witness could be challenged. A piece of physical evidence could be given another interpretation. Bundy's motives could be examined. Clark's own writings could be analyzed. But when all of those questions were placed together, the jury still had to answer one central question. Was there a reasonable explanation for the entire body of evidence that did not involve Clark as the killer? On January 27, 1983, the answer came. The jury found Douglas Clark guilty of 6 counts of first-degree murder. The verdict meant that the jurors had rejected the defense theory that Bundy and Murray were responsible for the killings attributed to Clark. The prosecution had succeeded in persuading them that the evidence, considered as a whole, established Clark's responsibility beyond a reasonable doubt. Clark was sentenced to death for the 6 murders. But the legal story was not finished. His case would continue through the appellate courts for years, and one part of the original judgment would eventually change. The California Supreme Court would later review the convictions, affirming the death sentences for the 6 murders while reversing the attempted murder and mayhem convictions associated with Charlene A. The distinction was important. It demonstrated that the court was not simply accepting every conclusion reached at trial. Individual convictions could be examined separately, evidence could be reconsidered, and some portions of the judgment could be overturned while the central murder convictions remained intact. For the families of the victims, however, the most important part of the verdict was that 6 deaths had been legally attributed to one man. The women whose lives had ended during the summer of 1980 had finally been connected to a defendant. In a courtroom, their names were no longer only entries in missing person reports or police files. They became the subjects of a prosecution that had taken years to assemble. Yet the verdict also left another complicated figure behind, Carol Bundy, the woman whose confession had opened the investigation and whose own actions had made her both witness and participant. Her fate would become intertwined with Clark's, but it would not be identical. Clark entered California's death row. Bundy received a long prison sentence, and the case that had begun with a series of unexplained deaths entered its final stage. The long aftermath of punishment, appeals, imprisonment, and questions that would remain long after the courtroom doors closed. The verdict on January 27, 1983, brought the trial to an end. But it did not bring the case to an end. Douglas Clark had been convicted of 6 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death 6 times. The jury had rejected his attempt to shift responsibility toward Carol Bundy and Jack Murray, and the prosecution's collection of physical evidence, witness testimony, telephone records, and Clark's own writings had been enough to establish his criminal responsibility for the 6 murders. Yet a death sentence in California did not mean an immediate execution. Clark entered the state's death row on March 24, 1983, beginning what would become approximately 4 decades behind bars. The distinction between a sentence and its eventual execution became particularly significant in Clark's case. For the victims' families, the verdict represented an official acknowledgement of responsibility. But the legal process continued, and Clark remained alive. His case moved through the appellate system, where individual aspects of the original trial were examined. The appeals would eventually demonstrate that even a conviction as serious as Clark's could contain individual legal issues without necessarily destroying the central findings of guilt. In 1992, the California Supreme Court reviewed the case. The court upheld the death sentences for the 6 murders. However, it reversed the attempted murder and mayhem convictions associated with the attack on Charlene A. The distinction is important because it separates what the court considered sufficiently established from what it found legally defective. Clark's conviction for the 6 murders remained intact. The ruling, therefore, did not erase the central judgment reached by the jury in 1983. It altered part of the judgment, while leaving the murder convictions and death sentences standing. For Clark, the practical consequence was that he remained on death row. For the victims' families, the legal process continued to preserve the 6 murder convictions even though another portion of the case had been overturned. During these years, the original events of 1980 increasingly became part of California's criminal history. The murders had begun with women disappearing from the streets around Los Angeles and with bodies being discovered in different locations. At first, there had been no obvious single explanation. Cynthia Chandler and Gina Morano were found together. Karen Jones was found near Sunset Boulevard. Exie Wilson's body was discovered separately, while her head was later found in a box. Marnette Comer had disappeared before her body was discovered near Foothill Boulevard. Jane Doe 18 remained unidentified. The eventual prosecution connected these cases through evidence that included the .25 caliber ammunition, the Raven pistol, witness testimony, telephone calls, vehicles, the garage evidence, and Bundy's account. But the passage of time did not make the individual victims less important. In fact, time created another responsibility: preserving their identities and remembering that the case was not simply about the man who was convicted. Marnette Comer was more than the woman whose clothing later became associated with Exie Wilson's remains. Cynthia Chandler was more than a 16-year-old murder victim. Gina Morano was more than the younger girl found beside her sister. Karen Jones was more than a body discovered near Sunset Boulevard. Exie Wilson was more than the victim whose remains became one of the most disturbing pieces of evidence in the investigation. Jane Doe 18 was more than an unidentified set of remains. Each had a life before the case reduced their names to evidence. The same passage of time also complicated the public memory of Carol Bundy. Her role could never be reduced to that of a simple informant. Bundy had contacted police on August 11, 1980, confessed to killing Jack Murray, and then provided information implicating Clark. But she had also admitted participating in the handling of Exie Wilson's remains and had acknowledged her own involvement in the violence. Her position in the story was therefore fundamentally different from that of an innocent witness who simply happened to know the killer. She was both participant and source of information. She had crossed the line herself, and yet her decision to contact police helped expose the wider series of crimes. Bundy ultimately received a sentence of 52 years to life for 2 killings. She remained incarcerated for the rest of her life. On December 9, 2003, she died at the Central California Women's Facility at the age of 61. Her death occurred 2 decades after Clark's conviction and left Clark as the only major figure from the original case still alive. The 2 people whose relationship had become central to the investigation would therefore follow very different paths through the prison system. Bundy died in custody in 2003. Clark remained on death row for another 20 years. During that time, the case retained a disturbing place in the history of Los Angeles crime. The circumstances surrounding the murders continued to attract attention because of the unusual combination of factors involved. Vulnerable women encountered around Sunset Boulevard, the repeated use of a .25 caliber weapon, the movement of bodies between locations, the relationship between Clark and Bundy, and the eventual discovery that the person providing information to police had herself committed a killing. Yet one point remained essential when discussing the case. Clark was convicted of 6 murders. There were suspicions that he might have been responsible for additional killings. But suspicion and conviction are not the same thing. The 6 murders for which he received death sentences were the cases established in court. Anything beyond those convictions must be described as suspicion rather than fact. This distinction matters because the history of serial murder can easily become distorted when confirmed crimes and possible crimes are merged into one number. The same principle applies to the psychological explanations surrounding Clark. The trial included evidence concerning violent sexual fantasies, S&M interests, prostitution, and material relating to necrophilia. These details helped prosecutors construct an explanation for motive and intent, but they should not be transformed into unsupported claims about every aspect of Clark's psychology. The court's judgment rested on evidence presented in the case, not on a fictionalized portrait of a monster. The evidence was concrete: firearms, ammunition, telephone records, witnesses, physical traces, vehicles, statements, and Clark's own writings. That collection of evidence was what transformed suspicion into conviction. Clark's own writings after his arrest remain particularly significant because they illustrated his continuing attempt to control the story surrounding the crimes. He tried to influence what other people would say and sought to direct responsibility toward Bundy and Murray. Instead, some of his writings became part of the prosecution's case because they contained information that prosecutors argued demonstrated knowledge of the crimes. In that sense, the legal aftermath did not simply preserve the evidence gathered before trial. It also added another layer of material generated by Clark himself. For decades, he remained in prison while California's death penalty system changed around him. The sentence imposed in 1983 remained a death sentence, but execution did not occur. Clark aged behind bars. The man who had been 32 when the murders occurred eventually became an elderly prisoner. By the time the 21st century was well underway, the crimes of 1980 were more than 40 years in the past. The world around them had changed dramatically, but Clark's sentence remained. Then, on October 11, 2023, the final chapter of his life arrived. Douglas Clark died at the age of 75 after approximately 40 years on death row. California corrections officials reported that his death was from natural causes, with the Marin County Coroner's Office responsible for the official determination. He was never executed. His death therefore ended a legal journey that had begun with a death sentence but never reached an execution chamber. There was no final courtroom confrontation and no execution date that brought the case to its conclusion. Instead, time itself became the final mechanism of punishment. Clark died in custody decades after the murders that had sent him there. The ending is unusual, but it does not change the legal record. He remained convicted of 6 murders until his death. The appeals had not erased those convictions. The passage of time had not erased the evidence. And the fact that he died of natural causes did not alter the 6 judgments entered against him. What remains most important, however, is not the length of Clark's imprisonment or the unusual fact that he survived on death row for 4 decades. It is the people whose lives were taken in 1980. Their names form the center of the case: Marnette Comer, Cynthia Chandler, Gina Morano, Karen Jones, Exie Wilson, and Jane Doe 18. Their deaths created the investigation. Their identities and remains created the evidence. Their families lived with the consequences long after the courtroom proceedings ended. The case is often remembered because of its shocking details, its unusual partnership, and its decades-long legal aftermath. But beneath those details is a simpler and more painful reality. 6 people were killed, and the lives they might have lived ended permanently in the summer of 1980. The investigation eventually identified a perpetrator, and the courts confirmed his responsibility for those 6 murders. But no conviction could restore the victims to their families. No sentence could undo the violence, and no passage of time could make their deaths less final. The Sunset Strip killings therefore remain not only a story about Douglas Clark and Carol Bundy, but a record of 6 lives lost and of an investigation that slowly transformed scattered deaths into one of Los Angeles's most notorious murder cases. More than 4 decades have passed since the murders that became known as the Sunset Strip killings. Yet the case remains disturbing not simply because of the violence involved, but because of how gradually the truth emerged. In the beginning, there was no single crime scene that explained everything. There were separate victims, separate locations, separate discoveries, and people who had no reason to believe that their experiences were connected. It was only after investigators assembled the evidence piece by piece that a larger pattern became visible. That pattern eventually led to Douglas Clark and Carol Bundy, a couple whose relationship had become entangled with violence, secrecy, and the deaths of vulnerable women in Los Angeles. The legal record established Clark's responsibility for 6 murders: Marnette Comer, Cynthia Chandler, Gina Morano, Karen Jones, Exie Wilson, and Jane Doe 18. Those 6 names are the most important conclusion of the case because they represent the people whose deaths were proven in court. The investigation also demonstrated the importance of distinguishing between what was established and what was merely suspected. Authorities believed Clark might have been responsible for additional killings, but those suspicions never carried the same legal status as the 6 murders for which he was convicted. That distinction matters especially in a case that has acquired a reputation over the decades. True crime stories can gradually become larger than the documented evidence. Numbers increase, rumors become facts, and uncertainty disappears from retellings. The Sunset Strip case deserves a more careful approach. What is known is already disturbing enough. Marnette Comer disappeared after being seen in a pink t-shirt bearing the words "Daddy's Girl." Her body was later discovered near Foothill Boulevard. Cynthia Chandler and Gina Morano, 16 and 15 years old, were found together near a freeway ramp beside Forest Lawn Cemetery. Karen Jones was found after being seen on Sunset Boulevard during the early morning hours. Exie Wilson's remains were separated, with her head eventually discovered inside a box. Jane Doe 18 remained unidentified and was connected to the case through evidence presented against Clark. These were not abstract pieces of a criminal investigation. They were individual human beings. Their vulnerability became part of the circumstances surrounding the crimes, but it should never become a reason to diminish their importance. Several of the women were involved in prostitution or lived unstable lives. That fact helps explain the environment in which Clark encountered some of them, but it does not explain away the violence committed against them. A person who is vulnerable is not less deserving of protection. A person whose life is complicated is not less deserving of justice. The investigation also illustrates how difficult such cases can be when victims move through environments where disappearances may not immediately attract the same attention as those of people with stable homes and predictable routines. The early investigation had to work with incomplete information. There was no obvious connection between a woman found near a highway and another whose remains were discovered somewhere else. The connection emerged through evidence. The .25 caliber ammunition became important. The Raven pistol became important. Telephone calls became important. Witnesses became important. The vehicles associated with Clark and Bundy became important. The garage evidence became important. Even Clark's own writings became important. None of these pieces alone necessarily told the entire story. Together, they formed the foundation of the prosecution's case. This is one of the most significant lessons of the investigation. Criminal cases are not always solved by a single dramatic discovery. Sometimes the truth is built through accumulation. A telephone record can seem ordinary. A firearm can seem like another object. A witness can remember only one conversation. A mark on a garage floor can seem ambiguous. A handwritten note can appear insignificant. But when investigators place those details beside one another, their meaning can change. In the Sunset Strip investigation, the evidence eventually pointed toward a common source. One of the most unusual elements of the case was the role of Carol Bundy. Her decision to contact police on August 11, 1980, opened the door to the investigation of Clark. But Bundy was not simply an innocent witness who happened to know something. She admitted killing Jack Murray. She also acknowledged participating in the handling of Exie Wilson's remains. Her own conduct made her part of the criminal story. At the same time, her information helped investigators understand crimes that might otherwise have remained disconnected. That contradiction is central to understanding her role. Bundy was both participant and informant, both offender and source of evidence. Her testimony could therefore never be considered in isolation. Investigators and prosecutors had to compare what she said against independent evidence. The fact that the case included ammunition, firearms, telephone records, physical traces, witnesses, and Clark's own writings gave the prosecution additional ways to test her account. The case also demonstrates the danger of assuming that a confession or accusation automatically tells the whole truth. Bundy had reasons to protect herself. Clark had reasons to deny responsibility. Both had motives to shape the narrative. The court, therefore, had to consider the broader body of evidence rather than simply choosing one. Pesant histoire. Ultimately, the jury accepted the prosecution's case against Clark. The verdict did not mean that every question surrounding the killings had been answered. It meant that the evidence was sufficient to establish guilt beyond a reasonable doubt for 6 murders. In 1983, Clark received 6 consecutive death sentences. In 1992, the California Supreme Court preserved those 6 murder convictions and death sentences while reversing the attempted murder and mayhem convictions connected to Charlene A.S. attack. That appellate distinction is another reminder that a criminal case is not a single moment. It can contain convictions that survive review and others that do not. The 6 murders remained legally established. Clark spent the following decades on death row. Carol Bundy died in prison in 2003. Clark remained incarcerated until his natural death in 2023. By then, the Los Angeles of 1980 had become a distant place. Buildings had changed. Technology had changed. Investigative methods had changed. The people involved in the original investigation had grown old or died. Yet the case remained part of the city's criminal history. Its persistence is partly due to the disturbing relationship between Clark and Bundy, and partly because of the unusual chain of evidence that connected the murders. But there is another reason it remains remembered. The investigation demonstrates how victims who initially appeared unrelated can eventually become part of one story. Each discovery added another piece. Each witness added another detail. Each piece of physical evidence narrowed the possibilities. Eventually, the investigation moved from uncertainty toward a courtroom where the evidence could be tested. The final chapter came not with an execution, but with Clark's death from natural causes at 75. He had spent approximately 40 years on death row. His sentence had remained in place, but California never carried it out. His death ended the possibility of further proceedings against him, but it did not change the convictions entered decades earlier. The case therefore closes with an uncomfortable contrast. The legal system reached a conclusion, but the human consequences could never be resolved. A conviction can establish responsibility. A sentence can impose punishment. An appeal can determine whether a conviction should stand. But none of those processes can return a person to the life they lost. For the families of the victims, the conclusion was never simply that a suspect had been identified. The conclusion was that someone they loved was gone. The names remain the clearest way to remember what the case was actually about. Marnette Comer, Cynthia Chandler, Gina Morano, Karen Jones, Exie Wilson, Jane Doe 18. They should not disappear beneath the names of the people who harmed them. Their stories are difficult to reconstruct because the surviving record naturally concentrates on the crimes, the investigation, and the accused. Yet even the limited information preserved in the case reminds us that each victim existed before, becoming evidence. They had relationships, routines, hopes, fears, and ordinary moments that never became part of the courtroom record. The murders ended those possibilities. That is the most important fact of all. The Sunset Strip killings are remembered as a notorious chapter in Los Angeles criminal history. But they should ultimately be understood as a tragedy involving 6 human lives and the people who survived them. Douglas Clark died in prison in 2023. Carol Bundy died in prison in 2003. The courtroom battles are over. The investigation is history. But the loss suffered by the victims' families does not have an expiration date. The most responsible way to remember the case is therefore not to glorify its perpetrators or to turn violence into spectacle. It is to understand how the evidence came together, recognize the uncertainty where uncertainty remains, and keep the victims at the center of the story. For decades later, that is what remains.